Vincent van Gogh is known for his complex personality, characterized by emotional depth, intense sensitivity, and struggles with mental health, which profoundly influenced his art and relationship. Today's theme: Beyond the Myth: How Vincent van Gogh's early years shaped the artist. Thor, welcome back. It's genuinely a pleasure to have you with us again. The last time you were here, you helped us peel back the layers of Vincent van Gogh's inner world, his sensitivity, his contradictions, his emotional depth. Today, we're diving into a theme that feels like the heart of everything we've discussed: Beyond the Myth: How Vincent van Gogh's early world forged the artist within. I can't think of anyone better suited to guide us through it.
Thank you. It's good to be back. Van Gogh is one of those rare figures where the myth has almost swallowed the man, and yet when you return to his early world, his family, his temperament, the emotional climate he grew up in, you begin to see how the artist was shaped long before he ever picked up a brush. I'm grateful for the chance to explore that with you.
And that's exactly what makes your perspective so compelling. You don't just look at the paintings, you look at the person behind them. You look at the child who became the artist.
That's where the truth lives. When you read about his childhood, being born after a stillborn brother, growing up in a pastor's household, being described as a serious, sensitive boy who preferred solitude, you start to understand the emotional architecture that shaped him. His art wasn't created despite that early world. It was created because of it.
And that's the journey we're taking today, moving past the myth of the tortured genius and into the emotional reality of the child who became Vincent van Gogh.
Exactly. Because when you understand the child, the adult makes sense. And when adults make sense, art becomes even more alive.
Or, when we talk about Vincent van Gogh, people often jump straight to the myth: the tortured artist, the severed ear, the tragic end. But when you look at him through a psychological lens, who do you see?
I see someone far more nuanced than the cliches allow. Van Gogh emerges as a man shaped by emotional intensity, deep vulnerability, and a relentless inner drive. Those weren't just personality quirks, they were the forces that carved his artistic path. His sensitivity wasn't a weakness. It was the very thing that allowed him to perceive the world with such raw immediacy.
That emotional depth seems to echo through his paintings. How do modern personality frameworks help us understand that?
They give us language for what we intuitively feel in his work. For instance, many interpret him as an INFP on the Myers-Briggs scale: introverted, intuitive, feeling, perceiving. That combination speaks to authenticity, idealism, and a refusal to create anything that didn't feel true to his inner world. And when you pair that with the Enneagram Type 4 with a 5 wing, the individualist, you get a portrait of someone who lived in constant dialogue with his emotions, always searching for meaning, always trying to express something uniquely his own. Enneagram Type 4 with a 5 wing describes a personality style defined by emotional depth, individuality, and introspective intensity. Type 4 brings the drive to understand one's inner world, express authentic feelings, and search for personal meaning. The 5 wing adds intellectual curiosity, analytical thinking, and a tendency to withdraw into observation and reflection. Together, this creates someone who feels deeply, thinks deeply, and often experiences life as both profoundly beautiful and profoundly complex.
So, his art becomes a kind of psychological mirror?
Exactly. His brushstrokes are emotional signatures. The swirling skies, the trembling fields, the way he uses yellow like a lifeline to hope. These aren't just stylistic choices. They're expressions of an inner world that was always in motion. His vulnerability and intensity didn't just influence his art, they became his art.
And yet, despite that intensity, there's a humility in him that people often overlook.
A profound humility. He never saw himself as a genius. He doubted his worth constantly, but that humility coexisted with an uncompromising authenticity. He wasn't painting for fame or approval. He was painting because he had to, because it was the only way he could make sense of the world and his place in it. That's why his legacy feels so human. It's not built on ego, it's built on sincerity.
When you look at his life through this psychological framing, what stands out to you the most?
The way his inner contradictions fueled his creativity. He longed for connection but often isolated himself. He craved stability but was driven by restless imagination. He felt deeply wounded by the world, yet he kept trying to offer it beauty. Those tensions created the emotional voltage that powers his paintings, understanding that makes his work feel even more alive.
So, in a way, studying his psychology doesn't demystify him, it deepens the mystery?
Absolutely. It shows us that his genius wasn't accidental. It was the result of a mind that felt everything intensely and refused to look away. And that's why his art still resonates. We're not just looking at landscapes or flowers. We're looking at the emotional architecture of a human being who lived with extraordinary depth.
The next turn in the dialogue opens naturally into the idea of complexity, how Van Gogh's inner contradictions didn't cancel each other out, but instead fused into the engine of his genius. Or, earlier you mentioned how Van Gogh's contradictions created a kind of emotional voltage in his work. When we look at his legacy through that lens, what do you think stands out most?
What stands out is how complexity becomes the through line of his entire life. Van Gogh wasn't one thing. He was a constellation of traits that shouldn't coexist so powerfully yet somehow did. His sensitivity, his idealism, his introspection, and his emotional intensity weren't separate threads. They were woven together into a single, restless psyche. And that interplay is what made his art so unmistakably alive.
It's interesting how modern personality frameworks help illuminate that. Do you think they genuinely deepen our understanding of him?
Absolutely. They don't reduce him, they reveal him. When you look at him as an INFP, you see the authenticity, the moral seriousness, the refusal to paint anything that didn't feel emotionally true. Through the Enneagram Type 4 with a 5 wing, you see the longing, the self-examination, the sense of being different, even exiled from ordinary life. And the disc lens highlights his introspective temperament, someone who processed the world inwardly, intensely, and often painfully. These frameworks give us vocabulary for what his paintings already whisper. DISC is a behavioral model with four primary styles. D. Dominance, direct, assertive, action-oriented, focused on results. I. Influence, expressive, social, enthusiastic, focused on connection. S. Steadiness, calm, patient, supportive, focused on stability and harmony. C. Conscientiousness, analytical, detail-oriented, reflective, focused on accuracy and depth. Every person has all four, but in different proportions. The model helps explain how someone behaves, not why. Van Gogh is often interpreted as high in C, conscientiousness, and S, steadiness. C-style traits, introspective, analytical, perfectionistic, detail-focused, reflective. S-style traits, gentle, sensitive, loyal, deeply committed to relationships, especially Theo.
So, his genius wasn't just technical skill?
Not at all. His technique mattered, of course, but his genius was emotional and psychological. He painted from the inside out. His brushstrokes are almost neurological. They map the way he felt the world, not the way he saw it. That's why his work resonates across cultures and centuries. You don't need to know art history to feel something when you stand in front of the starry night or sunflowers. His emotional truth is universal.
It's remarkable that someone who struggled so much internally could create something so expensive.
That's the paradox. His inner life was turbulent, but his art is generous. He gives us access to his vulnerability without ever asking for pity. And that's where the complexity becomes beautiful. His suffering didn't make him a genius, but his ability to transform that suffering into color, movement, and emotional clarity did. He turned personal struggle into universal beauty. That's an extraordinary psychological achievement.
When you think about his legacy through this psychological framing, what do you feel is the most important takeaway?
That Van Gogh's genius wasn't born from madness. It was born from humanity, from feeling deeply, caring intensely, and refusing to numb himself to the world. His complexity wasn't a flaw, it was his gift, an understanding that helps us see his paintings not as artifacts of a tragic life, but as expressions of a mind that was profoundly, courageously alive.
4. One of the most striking ideas in the psychological analysis is this notion of Van Gogh as an Enneagram Type 4 with a 5 wing, the individualist. How does that framework help us understand the engine behind his creativity?
It's incredibly revealing. Type 4s are driven by a need to express something uniquely their own, something authentic, something emotionally honest. When you add the 5 wings, you get this fascinating blend of emotional depth and intellectual curiosity. Van Gogh wasn't just painting feelings. He was studying them, dissecting them, trying to understand how color, form, and movement could translate inner experience into something visible. That combination is rare, and it's part of what made his voice so unmistakable.
That explains why he was willing to break rules so boldly.
Exactly. A Type 4 doesn't care about fitting in, they care about being true. And Van Gogh embodied that to an extreme. He wasn't chasing trends or approval. He was chasing emotional truth. That's why he embraced bold color, why he painted with such rawness, why his brushstrokes feel almost like handwriting. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was trying to express something that felt urgent and deeply personal.
There's also this sense of him being an outsider, which seems central to the Type 4 experience.
Absolutely. Type 4s often feel like they're standing just outside the circle of ordinary life, watching, longing, interpreting. Van Gogh lived in that tension. He desperately wanted connection, yet he was fiercely protective of his inner world. He could be intensely loving, but also intensely solitary. That push and pull shows up everywhere in his life, in his relationships, in his letters, and especially in his art.
How do you see that tension reflected in his paintings?
His art becomes the bridge between those two impulses. When he couldn't connect easily with people, he connected through color. When he felt misunderstood, he poured that longing into landscapes that tremble with emotion. When he felt isolated, he painted sunflowers that radiated warmth and hope. His canvases became the place where he could be fully himself without fear of rejection. They're intimate without being confessional, vulnerable without being fragile.
It's interesting how the 5 wing adds that layer of intellectual depth. How do you see that playing out?
The 5 wing gives him this almost analytical curiosity. He wasn't just painting intuitively, he was studying Japanese prints, experimenting with perspective, analyzing color theory, and writing long letters about technique. That intellectual rigor balanced his emotional intensity. Without the 5 wings, his work might have been purely expressive. With it, his expression becomes structured, intentional, and technically innovative. It's the blend of heart and mind that makes his style so powerful.
So, his genius wasn't just emotional, it was psychological and intellectual as well.
Exactly. His genius came from the interplay of all these forces. His sensitivity gave him emotional insight. His idealism gave him purpose. His introspection gave him depth. His intensity gave him urgency. And his intellectual curiosity gave him the tools to translate all of that into art. When you look at him through the Enneagram, MBTI, and DISC frameworks together, you see a mind that was constantly synthesizing emotion and thought, inner world and outer world. That synthesis is what made him revolutionary.
It sounds like understanding his personality doesn't simplify him, it makes him even more complex.
It does, but it also makes him more human. We stop seeing him as a tragic myth and start seeing him as a person who felt deeply, struggled deeply, and created with extraordinary sincerity. His art becomes not just a visual experience, but a psychological one. And that's why it still resonates. We're not just looking at paint, we're looking at a human being trying to make sense of himself.
4. Something that really stands out in the psychological analysis is Van Gogh's introspective nature. The DISC framework highlights how inward focused he was. How do you see that shaping his life and his art?
It shaped everything. Van Gogh wasn't just reflective, he lived almost entirely from the inside out. He spent long stretches alone, not out of misanthropy, but because solitude was the only place where he could hear himself clearly. His letters show this beautifully. He analyzed his emotions with almost surgical precision. He questioned his purpose constantly. He tried to extract meaning from every experience, whether it was a field of wheat or a moment of despair. That level of introspection wasn't a side trait. It was the foundation of his creative process.
His letters really do feel like windows into his mind.
Exactly. They're not just correspondence, they're self-portraits in words. You see him wrestling with ideas, with faith, with loneliness, with beauty. He wasn't content to simply feel something. He needed to understand it, articulate it, transform it. That's where the disc framework becomes so helpful. It highlights his reflective temperament, his tendency to process internally before acting externally. And that's precisely what you see in his art. He didn't imitate the world. He reinterpreted through the prism of his inner life.
That reinterpretation is so striking in his paintings. Nothing ever feels literal.
Because nothing was literal to him. A landscape wasn't just a landscape. It was an emotional state. A face wasn't just a face. It was a story, a burden, a hope. His introspection allowed him to see layers beneath the surface, and his art became a way to reveal those layers to others. Think about the starry night. It's not a depiction of a night sky. It's a depiction of what the night sky felt like to him in that moment, vast, turbulent, alive. That's introspection turned into visual language.
It's interesting how his solitude wasn't just isolation, it was generative.
Absolutely. Solitude was his workshop. It gave him the space to observe, to think, to feel deeply without interruption. But it also gave him the space to suffer. Introspection is a double-edged sword. It can lead to insight, but it can also lead to rumination, to self-doubt, to emotional overwhelm. Van Gogh lived on that edge constantly. And yet, instead of collapsing under it, he channeled it. His introspection didn't paralyze him, it propelled him. It fueled his evolution as an artist.
So, his inner world wasn't just a place he retreated to, it was the source of his innovation.
Exactly. His innovations weren't technical tricks. They were psychological breakthroughs. He painted the world as he experienced it, not as convention dictated. That's why his work feels so immediate, so intimate. You're not just looking at a scene, you're looking at his consciousness interpreting that scene. His introspection gave him the courage to trust his perceptions, even when they diverged from reality, and that divergence is what made him revolutionary.
It sounds like introspection was both his burden and his gift.
It was. It made him vulnerable, yes. It made him lonely. It made him question himself relentlessly. But it also gave him depth, empathy, and a kind of emotional intelligence that you can feel in every brushstroke. His introspection allowed him to turn personal struggle into universal beauty. And that's why his art endures. It's not just visually striking, it's psychologically resonant. You feel like you're being invited into someone's inner world, someone who dared to look inward with honesty and then share what he found.
The moment the conversation turns toward art as psychological expression, the dialogue naturally deepens. This is where Van Gogh stops being a historical figure and becomes a living mind. When we look at Van Gogh's work, it feels almost impossible to separate the art from the man. His paintings don't just depict scenes, they radiate emotion. How do his personality traits help us understand why his art feels so psychologically charged?
They explain everything. Van Gogh didn't paint the world as it appeared. He painted the world as it moved through him. His sensitivity, his idealism, his introspection, his emotional intensity, they converted into a kind of internal pressure that demanded expression. That's why his skies swirl, why his fields tremble, why his flowers glow with an almost spiritual luminosity. These aren't landscapes. They're psychological landscapes. They're portraits of his inner life.
That idea that his paintings are emotional maps feels so true when you look at them.
Exactly. And when you view him through the enneagram, MBTI, and disc frameworks, you start to see the mechanics behind that emotional charge. His bold colors? That's emotion taking precedence over realism. His dynamic brushwork? That's movement mirrors inner turbulence. His intimate subjects? That's empathy guiding his gaze. And the rapid evolution of his style? That's the constant search for authenticity that defined his personality. These frameworks don't reduce him. They reveal the psychological logic behind his visual language.
Let's talk about the colors. His palette is so distinctive, so fearless. What does that tell us about his inner world?
It tells us he felt deeply and unapologetically. Color was his emotional vocabulary. Yellow wasn't just yellow, it was hope, longing, spiritual hunger. Blue wasn't just blue, it was melancholy, introspection, the quiet ache of solitude. He used color the way poets use metaphor. And because he was so emotionally attuned, he trusted those instincts even when they defied convention. That's the INFP idealist in him, choosing emotional truth over external approval.
And the brushwork, those thick, rhythmic strokes. They almost feel alive.
They are alive. His brushwork is the closest thing we have to a seismograph of his inner state. The movement, the texture, the urgency, they mirror the turbulence inside him. You can almost feel his pulse in the paint. That's where the Enneagram 4W5 comes in. The emotional depth of the 4 combined with the analytical curiosity of the 5 created this unique fusion. Emotion structured by thought, chaos shaped by intention. His brushstrokes are not random. They're deliberate expressions of feeling.
His subjects often feel incredibly intimate, even when they're simple objects or landscapes.
That's his empathy. Van Gogh didn't just observe people or places, he felt them. He saw dignity in peasants, poetry in wheat fields, vulnerability in a pair of worn boots. His introspective nature meant he was always searching for meaning beneath the surface. And because he processed the world inwardly, everything he painted carries a trace of that inner dialogue. His subjects feel intimate because he approached them with emotional honesty.
And his style evolved so quickly. It's like he was constantly reinventing himself.
That's the hallmark of someone searching for authenticity. Van Gogh wasn't interested in mastering a single technique and repeating it. He was trying to find the visual language that matched his inner experience. And because his inner world was always shifting, always questioning, always feeling, his style evolved with it. That's why his work from Nunan looks nothing like his work from Arles. He wasn't changing styles. He was changing states of being.
So, understanding his personality doesn't take away the mystery, it deepens it.
Completely. It shows us that his genius wasn't just technical, it was emotional, psychological, profoundly human. His art becomes a record of a mind trying to make sense of itself. And that's why it resonates over time. We're not just looking at paint on canvas, we're looking at a human being translating inner chaos into beauty. His personality didn't just influence his art, it became his art.
Vincent's inwardness becomes easiest to see when you look at how it materializes in his paintings. Thor, earlier you described Vincent's introspection as both a refuge and a burden. I'd love to explore how that inwardness shows up in his paintings. When you look at specific works, what psychological layers do you see?
Each painting is like a chapter in his emotional autobiography. Vincent didn't paint the world as it looked, he painted the world as he felt it. And because his inner life was shaped by inconsistent attachment, emotional longing, and a father who valued duty over emotional expression, his paintings become symbolic expressions of those internal tensions. Talking about his father's life and death gives us a perfect entry point into this, especially with works like Still Life with Bible and the Old Church Tower at Nunan.
Let's start with the bedroom. It's deceptively simple. What's happening psychologically?
The bedroom is Vincent's attempt to paint emotional safety. The room is small, unclosed, almost womb-like. The tilted perspective and simplified forms make it feel childlike, as if he's trying to return to a place where he could rest without fear of rejection. This is the emotional world of someone who grew up with love that was present but not consistently felt. The empty chairs, the paired objects, the soft colors, they all reflect a longing for companionship and stability. It's a visual expression of the security base he never fully had as a child.
And Starry Night? It feels like pure emotion.
It is. Starry Night is Vincent's nervous system on canvas. The swirling sky mirrors the emotional turbulence of someone with anxious, preoccupied attachment, constant motion, constant intensity. The quiet village below represents the world that feels distant and unreachable. The cypress tree reaching upward is almost a cry, a symbol of yearning for connection, meaning, or transcendence. This is the painting of a man who feels everything deeply and alone.
Vincent's painting still life with Bible painted right after his father's death. How does that reflect his psychology?
This painting is a direct emotional conversation with his father. Theodorus's Dutch authorized Bible sits upright, authoritative, representing the faith and moral structure his father embodied. Next to it is a burnt-out candle, symbolizing his father's extinguished life. And in front of it lies Zola's La Joie de Vivre, representing Vincent's own worldview, earthy, humanistic, grounded in lived experience rather than doctrine. It's a symbolic negotiation. I honor your faith, but I must find my own path. This is introspection turned into visual language.
Interviewer, and the old church tower at Nuenen? The painting includes a single white cross marking his father's grave.
Yes, and that detail is incredibly revealing. The crumbling tower represents the fragility of the spiritual world he inherited. The solitary white cross is his father, distant, unreachable, yet central. This painting is Vincent grieving not just the man, but the relationship they never fully repaired. It's a memorial, but also a confession. I wanted to make you proud, and now it's too late. His introspection turns loss into symbolism.
And what about Portrait of Dr. Gachet?
Dr. Gachet becomes a psychological mirror. Vincent saw in him the same emotional fragility he carried from childhood. The drooping posture, the weary expression, the foxglove plant, a heart medicine, all reflect Vincent's own exhaustion and longing for understanding. This is introspection projected onto another person. He's painting himself through Gachet.
Does his father's influence show up in his early works too?
Absolutely. The moral seriousness of the potato eaters, the dignity of labor, the reverence for humble lives, comes directly from growing up in a pastor's household. But Vincent transforms his father's values into empathy rather than doctrine. He paints peasants not as subjects of sermons, but as human beings worthy of tenderness.
Thor, before we dive deeper into Van Gogh's adult psychology, I'd love to start with his childhood. Gabor Mate argues that our adult selves are shaped most profoundly by early attachment and emotional environments. When you look at Van Gogh through that framework, what stands out to you?
Vincent van Gogh's childhood becomes a revealing starting point when viewed through Gabor Mate's understanding of how early emotional environments shape adult personality. Mate emphasizes that who we become is not determined by temperament alone, but by the quality of our attachment, the attunement of our caregivers, the social world we enter, and the stresses, both genetic and environmental, that imprint themselves on us long before we can speak. Through that lens, Van Gogh's later intensity, vulnerability, and creative urgency begin to look less like mysteries and more like the natural outgrowth of a childhood marked by emotional absence, unspoken grief, and a longing for connection that was never fully met. What stands out is how much of his adult emotional landscape was already seeded in those early years. Mate's view is that children adapt to the emotional climate around them, and Van Gogh grew up in a home shadowed by unresolved grief. Being born exactly 1 year after a stillborn brother, given the same name, created a kind of existential displacement from the start. Add to that a mother who was emotionally distant and a father who was kind but reserved, and you see a child who learned early that emotional attune wasn't guaranteed. That shapes everything: sensitivity, self-doubt, longing, even the way he later painted the world.
So, his adult intensity wasn't random, it was rooted in adaptation?
Exactly. Mate would say that Van Gogh's sensitivity, his hunger for connection, and even his volatility was not flaws, but survival strategies formed in childhood. They became the psychological soil from which his art eventually grew.
Sure, we've talked about Van Gogh's personality through the Enneagram, MBTI, and disc lens. But when we bring in Gabor Mate's childhood behavioral theory, attachment, caregiver attunement, early socialization, it adds a whole new dimension. How do you see Van Gogh's early years shaping the adult he became?
It's impossible to understand Van Gogh without going back to his childhood. Mate's core idea is that children don't just inherit traits, they adapt to their environment. And Van Gogh's environment was emotionally complex from the very beginning. He was born exactly 1 year after his stillborn brother, who also bore the name Vincent. Imagine that, growing up in the shadow of a ghost, walking past a gravestone with your own name on it. That alone shapes a child's sense of identity, belonging, and emotional safety.
That must have created a kind of existential confusion very early on.
Exactly. Mate would say that a child in that situation absorbs a subtle but powerful message. You are here, but you are replacing someone who was lost. That can create a deep, pre-verbal insecurity sense of being both cherished and not quite enough. And then you add his mother's emotional distance, her grief, her depression. She wasn't intentionally neglectful, but she was unavailable. According to attachment theory, that's the perfect recipe for an anxious, hyper-attuned child.
Hyperattuned in the sense of being overly sensitive to emotional cues?
Yes. Mate describes how children in emotionally unpredictable environments develop heightened sensitivity as a survival strategy. They become experts at reading micro-expressions, shifts in tone, subtle changes in mood. Van Gogh's later emotional intensity, his sensitivity to beauty, to suffering, to rejection, wasn't random. It was an adaptation. His nervous system learned early on that emotional vigilance was necessary.
That makes his adult emotional volatility feel less like a flaw and more like a wound.
Precisely. Mate always emphasizes that what we call disorders are often adaptations to early stress. Van Gogh's intensity, his longing for connection, his fear of abandonment, his deep empathy, they all trace back to those early attachment ruptures. He wasn't born fragile. He became fragile because he had to navigate emotional terrain without a consistently attuned caregiver.
How would you describe his attachment style through this lens?
He fits the pattern of an anxious, preoccupied attachment. He craved closeness but feared rejection. He idealized relationships, then panicked when they didn't meet his emotional needs. You see this in his romantic pursuits, in his friendship with Gauguin, even in his relationship with Theo. He loved intensely, sometimes overwhelmingly, because he was trying to fill an emotional void that began in childhood.
And his art becomes part of that attachment system?
Absolutely. When human relationships felt unstable, art became the secure base he never had. Painting was the one place where he could express himself without fear of abandonment. His canvases didn't reject him. They didn't misunderstand him. They absorbed everything, his longing, his sorrow, his hope. In Mate's terms, art became his self-regulation, his way of soothing a nervous system shaped by early insecurity.
What about caregiver interactions? How did his family dynamics shape him?
His father was a pastor, kind, but emotionally reserved. His mother was grieving, often withdrawn. Neither parent provided the emotional mirroring that Mate says is essential for healthy development. A child learns who they are through the eyes of their caregivers. Van Gogh didn't get that. So, he grew up with a fragile sense of self, constantly questioning his worth, constantly seeking validation. That's why he poured so much of himself into his work. He was trying to answer the question, do I matter?
And socialization? He always seemed to feel like an outsider.
Yes, and that's another Mate theme. Children who don't feel emotionally safe at home often struggle socially. Van Gogh was awkward, intense, and overly earnest. He didn't fit in with peers. That outsider identity became part of his adult personality, what the Enneagram calls the individualist. But again, it wasn't inherent. It was shaped by early experiences of not belonging, not being mirrored, not being understood.
So, when we look at the adult Van Gogh, the intensity, the longing, the creativity, we're really seeing the echoes of a child trying to make sense of his world?
Exactly. Maid would say that Van Gogh's art is the adult expression of a child's unmet needs. His paintings are full of yearning, tenderness, turbulence, and hope because he was full of those things. His genius wasn't separate from his wounds. It was born from them. And that's what makes his work so profoundly human. He painted not just what he saw, but what he felt, and those feelings were shaped long before he ever picked up a brush.
Thor, when we look at Van Gogh's early childhood through Gabor Mate's lens, his mother, Anna Carbentus, becomes a central figure. Who was she, and how did she shape the emotional world Vincent grew up in?
Anna Carbentus is one of the most quietly influential figures in Vincent's life. She was born in 1819, raised in a large family, and learned responsibility early after losing her own mother at 16. That loss shaped her. She became dutiful, resilient, and expressive in her own way, but also emotionally guarded. According to historical accounts, she was a devoted mother who valued nature, beauty, and order, and she passed those values on to Vincent. She gave him his first drawing lessons and encouraged his eye for detail. But at the same time, she struggled to offer the kind of emotional attune Mate says is essential for secure attachment.
Interviewer, so, she gave him inspiration, but not necessarily emotional safety?
Exactly. She nurtured his aesthetic sensitivity, but not his emotional sensitivity. She loved nature, flowers, landscapes, sketched them, collected them, wrote about them. Vincent absorbed that. His lifelong reverence for fields, trees, and skies comes directly from her. But emotionally, she was distant. She expressed love through words and letters, not through physical affection or attuned presence. That's a crucial distinction in Mate's theory. A child needs emotional resonance, not just verbal reassurance.
And this emotional distance was happening in a home already marked by grief.
Yes. Vincent was born exactly 1 year after his parents' first child, also named Vincent, was stillborn. Anna never fully processed that grief. Imagine the emotional atmosphere. A mother mourning a lost child while holding a new baby with the same name. Mate would say that infants absorb the emotional states of their caregivers. Vincent grew up in a home where sadness was unspoken but ever present. That shapes a child's nervous system. It creates hypervigilance, sensitivity, and a deep, lifelong longing for connection.
That longing shows up everywhere in his adult life.
It does. His intense attachments, his fear of abandonment, his idealization of relationships, all those traces back to early attachment patterns. Anna wasn't unloving, but she was inconsistent. She could be warm in letters, but withdrawn in person. She valued propriety and discipline, which clashed with Vincent's emotional intensity. So he learned early that his feelings were too much, that he had to manage them alone. That's classic anxious, preoccupied attachment.
You mentioned that his mother instilled in him a love for nature. How does that fit into Mate's framework?
Nature became Vincent's first safe attachment. When a child doesn't receive consistent emotional mirroring from a caregiver, they often turn to something else: books, imagination, animals, or in Vincent's case, the natural world. Anna took him on walks, taught him the names of flowers, showed him how light changed across the day. Those moments were probably the closest he felt to emotional connection with her. So, nature became his emotional refuge. Later, when human relationships overwhelmed him, he returned to fields, trees, and skies. And eventually, he painted them with the intensity of someone painting a beloved companion.
That makes his landscapes feel even more intimate.
They are intimate. They're not just scenes, they're emotional memories. They're echoes of the only place he felt truly held as a child.
What about his mother's expectations? Did they shape his sense of self?
Very much. Anna valued order, respectability, and social conformity. Vincent was none of those things. He was intense, sensitive, impulsive. He didn't fit the mold she had in mind. Mate would say that when a child senses, even subtly, that their authentic self is unwelcome, they develop shame and self-doubt. Vincent carried that his whole life. He questioned his worth constantly. He apologized for his existence in letters. He tried to earn love through effort, first through religion, then through relationships, and finally through art.
So his drive wasn't just creative, it was emotional.
Exactly. His art wasn't only expression, it was a plea. See me, understand me, love me. That longing began with his mother.
And yet, despite the emotional distance, she clearly influenced his artistic development.
Absolutely. She introduced him to drawing. She taught him to observe. She modeled a reverence for beauty. Even late in life, when their relationship was strained, he painted the church in Nuenen to cheer her up after she broke her leg. That gesture says everything. He still longed for her approval, her affection, her recognition. Their bond was complicated, but foundational. She gave him the tools of beauty, even if she couldn't give him the emotional grounding he needed.
Thor, you've painted a vivid picture of Anna Carbentus, loving, expressive in letters, but emotionally distant in daily life. How did that early dynamic shape the way Vincent related to people later in life?
Vincent van Gogh's early emotional world, shaped by a mother who loved him in words but struggled to attune to him in presence, casts a long shadow over the relationships he later formed as an adult. Through Gabor Mate's lens, the echoes of Anna Carbentus's emotional style become visible in Vincent's bonds with Theo and Gauguin. I describe Anna as expressive, nature-loving, and devoted, yet emotionally restrained and overwhelmed by Vincent's intensity. That combination, love without attunement, creates the exact attachment pattern Mate identifies as anxious preoccupied, longing, self-doubt, and fear of abandonment. It shaped everything. When a child receives love that is inconsistent, warm in words, cool in presence, they grow up with a kind of emotional hunger. Mate would say that Vincent learned early that affection was something he had to earn, not something freely given. That creates a lifelong pattern of longing, self-doubt, and a fear of abandonment. And you see that pattern repeated in every major relationship he had as an adult.
Let's start with Theo. Their bond is often described as the emotional core of Vincent's life.
Absolutely. Theo became the secure attachment figure Vincent never fully had with his mother. He offered what Anna couldn't: consistent emotional presence. Vincent's letters to Theo read like a child reaching for attunement, seeking reassurance, validation, and unconditional acceptance. Theo didn't just support him financially, he stabilized him emotionally. In Mate's terms, Theo became the regulating other, the person who soothed the nervous system shaped by early insecurity.
And that explains why Vincent leaned on him so intensely.
Exactly. Vincent wasn't just asking for help, he was asking for the emotional safety he had missed as a child. Theo's belief in him filled a void that Anna's emotional distance had created. Their relationship wasn't just brotherly, it was compensatory. It was Vincent trying to repair an early attachment wound.
What about Gauguin? Their relationship was famously volatile.
Gauguin triggered Vincent's deepest childhood wounds. He was charismatic, independent, emotionally unavailable, exactly the kind of figure who activates an anxious, preoccupied attachment. Vincent idealized him, just as he had idealized his mother's approval. But Gauguin's detachment mirrored Anna's emotional distance. When Gauguin pulled away, Vincent panicked. The tension in the Yellow House wasn't just artistic conflict, it was attachment reenactment. Vincent was reliving the emotional push-pull of childhood, longing for closeness, fearing rejection, and feeling too much.
So, the crisis with the year wasn't just about Gauguin leaving?
No, it was about the terror of abandonment. Mate would say that when early attachment wounds are triggered, the nervous system goes into survival mode. Vincent wasn't reacting to a friend leaving, he was reacting to the emotional script written in childhood. If someone pulls away, it means you are unlovable.
You mentioned earlier that nature became a kind of surrogate attachment. How does that fit into this pattern?
Nature was the one place where Vincent felt held. His mother introduced him to flowers, fields, and light, and those moments were probably the closest he came to emotional connection with her. So, as an adult, when relationships overwhelmed him, he returned to nature. And eventually, he painted it with the devotion of someone painting a beloved companion. His landscapes aren't just scenes, they're emotional sanctuaries.
When you look at all of this together, what do you see?
Thor, I see a man whose adult relationships were shaped by a childhood of inconsistent love. His longing, his volatility, his empathy, his despair, they weren't random. They were the echoes of a child trying to make sense of a mother who loved him but couldn't fully feel him. And that emotional script didn't just shape his relationship, shaped his art. His paintings are full of yearning, tenderness, turbulence, and hope because he was full of those things. His genius wasn't separate from his wounds. He was born from them.
Thor, we've talked a lot about Vincent's mother and how her emotional distance shaped him. But what about his father, Theodorus van Gogh? Who was he, and how did he influence Vincent's upbringing?
Vincent van Gogh's father, Theodorus van Gogh, adds an entirely different emotional layer to Vincent's childhood, one that becomes even clearer when viewed through Gabor Mate's framework. Theodorus is a fascinating figure because he represents the other half of Vincent's emotional inheritance. He was a pastor in the Dutch Reformed Church, gentle, principled, and deeply committed to his faith. History describes him as loving and spiritually grounded, but also reserved and somewhat rigid. He believed in duty, discipline, and respectability. And that created a very particular emotional environment for a child like Vincent, who was sensitive, intense, and searching for emotional resonance.
So, Theodorus wasn't cold, but he wasn't emotionally attuned either?
Exactly. He loved his children, but he expressed that love through structure, not emotional presence. In Mate's terms, he provided care but not attune. He offered stability, but not the kind of deep emotional mirroring that a child like Vincent desperately needed. And because Vincent was so emotionally porous, he interpreted that lack of attune as a lack of acceptance.
That must have created tension between them.
It did. Theodorus valued conformity and moral duty. Vincent valued authenticity and emotional truth. Those two worldviews collided constantly. Vincent's intensity overwhelmed his father, and his father's restraint frustrated Vincent. Theodorus wanted a son who followed a respectable path: pastor, teacher, art dealer. Vincent wanted to follow the emotional and spiritual currents inside him. That mismatch created a lifelong sense of not being enough, which Mate identifies as a core wound in anxious, preoccupied attachment.
How did growing up in a pastor's home shape Vincent's emotional world?
It shaped him in two major ways. First, it gave him a deep moral sensitivity. Vincent cared about suffering, poverty, and human dignity because he grew up in a home where those values were preached daily. Second, it created a pressure to be good, obedient, and spiritually aligned traits that clashed with his emotional volatility. Mate would say that when a child's authentic emotional expression conflicts with the family's expectations, the child learns to suppress parts of themselves. Vincent internalized the belief that his intensity was a flaw, something that disappointed his father. That belief followed him into adulthood.
Vincent tried to become a pastor at one point. Was that connected to his father?
Absolutely. Vincent's attempt to follow in his father's footsteps was a bid for approval. He wanted to be the son his father could be proud of, but he approached ministry with the same emotional intensity he brought to everything: giving away his possessions, living among minors, identifying with the poor. The church rejected him for being too humble, and that rejection devastated him. It wasn't just a career failure, it was a symbolic failure to become the son his father wanted.
That must have deepened his sense of inadequacy.
It did. Mate would say that this reinforced the childhood wound. I am not enough as I am. That wound became the emotional engine behind his art.
The relationship between father and son became strained later in life. What was driving that strain?
Theodora struggled to understand Vincent's choices, his poverty, his unconventional relationships, his obsession with art. He saw Vincent as unstable, even irresponsible. At one point, he even considered committing him to an asylum. But beneath the conflict, there was love. Theodorus wasn't rejecting Vincent, he was frightened for him. But because he lacked emotional attune, that fear came across as criticism. For Vincent, who was already wounded by early emotional inconsistency, this felt like rejection. It reinforced the belief that he was a disappointment.
Did Theodorus influence Vincent's art in any way?
Indirectly, yes. The moral seriousness for ordinary people, the spiritual longing of that came from his father. Vincent's paintings of peasants, workers, and rural life reflect the values he absorbed in his father's home. But the emotional intensity, the vulnerability, the rawness that came from Vincent himself, shaped by the tension between his inner world and his father's expectations.
When you look at Vincent's adult relationships through Mate's lens, how does his father's influence show up?
In several ways. Fear of disappointing others, rooted in his father's expectations. Longing for approval, his attempts to earn his father's pride. Attraction to emotionally unavailable people, echoing his father's emotional restraint. Self-sacrificing tendencies, reflecting the moral values of a pastor's household. Deep empathy for suffering, a spiritual inheritance from Theodorus. Vincent's adult emotional patterns weren't random. They were the continuation of a childhood shaped by love without a tune, structure without emotional resonance.
So, both parents shaped him in different ways?
Yes, his mother shaped his sensitivity and longing. His father shaped his moral seriousness and self-doubt. Together, they created the emotional landscape that fueled his art. Vincent's genius wasn't born despite his parents. It was born through the emotional contradictions they embodied.
Thor, now that we've explored who Theodorus was, I'm curious how his presence and his limitations show up in Vincent's art. When you look at themes like spirituality, rural life, and the dignity of ordinary people, do you see his father's influence?
Absolutely. Theodorus's influence is woven into Vincent's work in ways that are subtle but profound. Even though their relationship was tense, the values Theodorus embodied, faith, humility, compassion for the poor, became central to Vincent's artistic identity. You talk about Theodorus as a pastor who served small rural congregations, someone respected for his spiritual qualities even if he wasn't a great preacher. That environment shaped Vincent's worldview long before he ever picked up a brush.
Let's start with spirituality. How does Theodorus show up there?
Vincent's spirituality was deeply shaped by his father, even though he eventually rejected the institutional church. Theodorus's Bible, his sermons, his moral seriousness, all of that formed the foundation of Vincent's early identity. But Vincent internalized it differently. Where Theodorus saw faith as structure and doctrine, Vincent saw it as compassion and lived experience. You see this tension most clearly in Still Life with Bible, 1885. Historical Facts explains that Vincent painted this shortly after his father's death, placing Theodorus's Dutch authorized Bible next to Emile Zola's La Joie de Vivre. The Bible represents his father's faith, authoritative, rigid, inherited. The burned-out candle suggests the extinguishing of his father's life. Zola's novel represents Vincent's own worldview, earthy, humanistic, grounded in lived experience. It's a visual conversation with his father, a reconciliation of two spiritual paths.
Interviewer, so the painting becomes a symbolic negotiation between father and son?
Exactly. It's Vincent saying, I honor your faith, but I must find my own way.
What about rural life? Vincent's early paintings are full of peasants, fields, and village churches.
That comes directly from Theodorus's pastoral assignments. He served in small villages, Etten, Helvwart, Nunnen, where Vincent grew up surrounded by farmers, weavers, and laborers. Theodorus was always assigned to modest congregations, and he was respected for his spiritual qualities rather than his preaching. Vincent absorbed that world deeply. But where his father saw a congregation, Vincent saw humanity, weathered hands, tired faces, quiet dignity. His early works like The Potato Eaters are infused with a moral seriousness that echoes his father's values, but expressed through empathy rather than doctrine. The earthy palette reflects the soil-based lives of rural workers. The somber lighting mirrors the spiritual humility of his father's ministry. The focus on labor honors the dignity of ordinary people.
So even though he rebelled against his father's expectations, he carried his father's moral worldview into his art?
Completely. Vincent rejected the church, but he never rejected the compassion at the heart of his father's calling.
And the dignity of ordinary people, how does that connect to Theodorus?
Theodorus believed in serving the humble, the poor, the overlooked. Vincent inherited that moral compass. But instead of preaching sermons, he painted them. His portraits of peasants, weavers, and laborers are visual homilies, quiet affirmations of human worth. Theodorus loved his son but was disappointed by his failures, especially in ministry. Vincent internalized that disappointment, but he also internalized the compassion behind his father's vocation. That's why his art is filled with weathered faces that radiate resilience, hands at work that speak of dignity, simple interiors that feel sacred, fields and churches that echo his father's world. Vincent transformed his father's moral values into a visual language.
Talking about the old church tower at Nuenen, how does that fit into this emotional landscape?
That painting is a direct tribute to his father. Theodorus was buried at the foot of the old church tower, and Vincent painted it just months after the funeral. The painting includes a single white cross marking his father's grave. It's a painting of grief, but also of reconciliation. Vincent couldn't prove himself to his father in life, but he honored him in art. The crumbling tower, the solitary cross, the muted palette, all reflect Vincent's complex feelings: love, loss, regret, and longing for connection that was never fully realized.
When you see the father's shadow and a son's genius all together, what do you see?
I see a son who carried his father's values even as he struggled under his father's expectations. Theodorus shaped Vincent's spirituality, his empathy, his moral seriousness, and his reverence for ordinary life. Vincent's art becomes the place where he transforms that inheritance, where he turns structure into emotion, doctrine into compassion, and disappointment into beauty.
Or, we've traced how Vincent's parents shaped his emotional blueprint, his mother's inconsistent attune, his father's restrained love and high expectations. But what fascinates me is how all of this turned inward. Vincent wasn't just sensitive, he was profoundly introspective. How did that inwardness shape the way he related to people later in life?
Vincent's introspection was both his refuge and his burden. It gave him extraordinary emotional insight, but it also made relationships incredibly difficult. He didn't just feel emotions, he analyzed them, magnified them, lived inside them. And because his early attachments were inconsistent, he learned to rely on his inner world more than the outer one. That inwardness became the lens through which he interpreted every relationship.
So, his introspection wasn't just a personality trait, it was an adaptation?
Exactly. Gabor Mate would say that when a child doesn't receive steady emotional attune, they turn inward to make sense of themselves. Vincent grew up in a home where love was present but not consistently felt. His mother expressed affection in letters but struggled with emotional presence. His father cared deeply but emphasized duty over emotional connection. That combination teaches a child to self-soothe through thought, imagination, and internal dialogue. Vincent's letters, thousands of pages of reflection, are the adult expression of that childhood adaptation.
How did that inwardness affect his relationships with people like Theo or Gauguin?
It made him both deeply loving and deeply afraid. Vincent's introspection amplified his fear of being too much, a fear rooted in childhood, when his intensity overwhelmed his parents. So, in adulthood, He oscillated between emotional closeness and emotional panic. With Theo, he poured out his soul because Theo felt safe. With Gauguin, he idealized the friendship, then panicked when he sensed withdrawal. His introspection made him hyper-aware of every shift in tone, every silence, every perceived rejection.
That sounds exhausting for him and for the people around him.
It was. Vincent didn't have emotional filters. Everything went straight to the core. And because he processed everything internally, he often misunderstood others' intentions. A delayed letter felt like abandonment. A disagreement felt like betrayal. His introspection magnified emotional wounds that were already deep.
And conflict? How did introspection shape the way he handled tension?
Poorly, Vincent internalized everything. Instead of expressing hurt directly, he ruminated. Instead of setting boundaries, he absorbed blame. Instead of stepping back, he intensified his emotional investment. His introspection made him vulnerable to emotional spirals. When Gauguin pulled away, Vincent didn't just feel rejected, he relived the emotional instability of childhood. His inwardness turned conflict into crisis.
And yet, that same inwardness is what made his art so powerful.
Absolutely. His introspection allowed him to translate emotion into color, movement, and form with unprecedented honesty. His paintings are emotional landscapes because he lived inside his emotions. The swirling sky of Starry Night, the trembling fields of Arles, the intimate simplicity of the bedroom, these are not external scenes. They are internal states. His introspection made him a difficult companion, but an extraordinary artist.
When you look at all of this together, what's the core insight?
Vincent's inwardness was the child's solution to an emotionally unpredictable world. It shaped his relationships by making him deeply empathetic, deeply sensitive, deeply fearful of abandonment, deeply longing for connection, deeply prone to emotional overwhelm. And it shaped his art by giving him a direct channel from inner experience to visual expression. His introspection was both his wound and his genius.
Thor, we've talked about Vincent's sensitivity, his introspection, and the emotional complexity of his childhood. But I want to go deeper into something you hinted at earlier. Could Vincent van Gogh's mental suffering be partly rooted in what you called narcissistic-induced instability from his father?
I think that's a psychologically responsible question, especially when we look at it through Gabor-Mate's framework. And the key is nuance. We're not talking about clinical narcissism or intentional harm. We're talking about an emotional environment shaped by a father whose personality, role, and cultural expectations created conditions that a highly sensitive child like Vincent had to adapt to.
So, you're saying the father didn't have to be a narcissist for the environment to feel narcissistic to the child?
Exactly. When we look at the historical record, Theodorus van Gogh was respected, principled, and loving, but also emotionally restrained, concerned with propriety, and deeply invested in his pastoral role. Many arts historian describes Vincent's fathers as handsome, with a loving nature, yet also someone who expected much from Vincent and was disappointed when he didn't measure up. It also notes that Vincent's unconventional behavior reflected poorly on him and the family. Those are classic ingredients of what psychologists today call role-based or vulnerable narcissistic traits, not malicious, but emotionally rigid.
How does the emotional climate of a pastor's household create instability for a child?
Imagine being a child who is naturally intense, sensitive, and emotionally expressive, then growing up in a home where emotional restraint is the norm, where the father's identity is tied to moral authority, and where the family's reputation is paramount. That creates a subtle but powerful message. Your feelings are too much. Your impulses are dangerous. Your authenticity threatens the family's image. For a child like Vincent, that becomes internalized as shame and self-doubt.
Interviewer, and that's where Mate's idea of developmental trauma comes in?
Exactly. Mate argues that trauma isn't what happens to you, it's what happens inside you when your emotional needs aren't met. Vincent's father didn't abuse him, but he couldn't attune to him. He couldn't meet him where he was. And it clear that Vincent knew that in his father's eyes he was a disappointment and failure. That's devastating for a child.
So, what does narcissistic induced instability mean in this context?
It means growing up in an environment where the parent's emotional needs overshadow the child's. The child must adapt to the parent's expectations. The child becomes hypertuned to the parent's moods. Love feels conditional. Approval is tied to performance. Authenticity feels risky. These are not signs of a narcissistic parent. They are signs of a narcissistic emotional system. And Vincent was the kind of child who would feel that system intensely.
How did Vincent's temperament interact with that environment?
Vincent was born with a nervous system that felt everything deeply. Combine that with a mother grieving a stillborn child, a father who valued duty over emotional expression, a household where reputation mattered, a child who was unconventional, short-tempered, and passionate, and you get a perfect storm. A sensitive child in a rigid emotional system often develops anxious, preoccupied attachment, chronic self-doubt, fear of disappointing others, emotional volatility, intense longing for connection, difficulty regulating emotions. These are not signs of narcissism. They are signs of adaptation.
How does early adult suffering show up in his adult life?
Everywhere. In his desperate need for Theo's approval, in his idealization of Gauguin, in his fear of abandonment, in his intense romantic attachments, in his emotional spirals, in his lifelong sense of being not enough. Even notes that Vincent tried to become a great artist so that his father would forgive him and be proud of him. That's the voice of a child still trying to earn love.
And does this emotional inheritance show up in his paintings too?
Absolutely. His art is the emotional autobiography of a child who grew up in a home where love existed, but emotional attunement did not. The bedroom, longing for safety, starry night, emotional overwhelm, still life with Bible, negotiation with his father's worldview, old church tower, grief and unresolved attachment. These are not just paintings. They are psychological documents.
So, where does that leave us? Was his father responsible for his mental suffering?
No. But the emotional environment his father helped create shaped Vincent's vulnerability. Theodorus was a good man, respected, loving, principled, but he was also emotionally limited, rigid, and unable to meet the needs of a child as sensitive as Vincent. So, the answer is Vincent's suffering wasn't caused by a narcissistic father. It was shaped by a narcissistic emotional environment, one that his father, unintentionally, helped create.
Or, we've talked about how Vincent's father may have created a kind of narcissistic emotional environment, not through abuse, but through emotional restraint, high expectations, and a role based identity. But what about the rest of his family? Or even childhood friends? Could they have contributed to the instability that shaped his adult suffering?
Absolutely, and his early years gives us a lot to work with. Vincent didn't grow up in a vacuum. He grew up in a tight, reputation-focused pastor's household, surrounded by siblings, extended family, and a small rural community. And when you look at that environment through Gabor Mate's lens, you see multiple layers of emotional pressure, not just from his father, but from the entire social ecosystem around him.
Vincent was born exactly 1 year after a stillborn brother with the same name. How does that factor in?
That's huge. Even though historical facts says there's little or no evidence Vincent consciously knew much about the dead brother, the psychological impact doesn't require conscious knowledge. Mate would say that a child absorbs the emotional atmosphere of the home. And this home was marked by unresolved grief. A child born into grief often becomes hyperattuned, anxious, eager to please, afraid of disappointment, emotionally vigilant. That's the foundation of anxious preoccupied attachment. And it's not just the parents. The entire family system treats the child differently when he is unconsciously filling the space of someone lost.
What about his siblings? Did they contribute to this emotional climate?
Yes, especially his sisters. His sister Elizabeth recalls Vincent being a serious, sensitive boy who preferred solitude and appeared slightly strange to others. That's a revealing line. It shows that even within the family, Vincent was already being othered, seen as strange, different, not fitting in. In a pastor's household, where propriety and social appearance matter, being strange is not neutral. It creates subtle shame, pressure to conform, emotional self-suppression, a sense of being the difficult child. This is not abuse, but it is a form of narcissistic induced instability because the child learns, I must not embarrass the family. I must not be too much.
Vincent had preferred solitude to friends. Could that be a sign of social instability?
Yes, and it's a crucial one. States historical facts. He preferred solitude to the companionship of family and friends. This tells us two things. First, he didn't feel emotionally safe with peers. Second, he didn't feel emotionally safe with siblings. Children withdraw when they feel misunderstood, judged, compared, pressured, or emotionally unsafe. In a small village, being the pastor's son adds another layer. Everyone watches you. Everyone expects you to behave. Everyone compares you to your father. That's a classic social narcissistic environment, not because anyone is malicious, but because the child is constantly performing under the gaze of the community.
His uncle who got him his first job. Could that have played a role?
Yes, Uncle Sent, a powerful figure in the Goupil art firm. Historical notes confirm his uncle Vincent secured the position for his nephew. This means Vincent's early career wasn't chosen assigned. In a family system with narcissistic traits, children often become extensions of the family's ambitions, tools for maintaining reputation, symbols of success or failure. When Vincent later failed at Goupil, it wasn't just a job loss. It was a narcissistic injury to the family system, and he felt that shame deeply.
Vincent was also sent away to boarding school at age 11. How does that fit in?
That's another destabilizing factor. From 1864 to 1866, he attended a boarding school in Zevenbergen. For a sensitive child, being sent away can feel like abandonment, rejection, punishment, emotional exile. And remember, this is a child already living in the shadow of a dead brother, already feeling strange, already struggling to fit into a pastor's household. Boarding school reinforces the message. You don't belong here. You are too much.
What about the broader community? Could they have contributed to this instability?
Absolutely. In a small Dutch village, the pastor's family is constantly watched. Historical facts emphasizes that his father was a pastor in multiple towns. That means Vincent was always the pastor's son, expected to behave, expected to be moral, expected to reflect well on the family. For a child who was eccentric, sensitive, and emotionally intense, this creates chronic self-monitoring, a hallmark of developmental trauma.
So, what's the conclusion? Was it just the father, or was it the whole system have contributed to narcissistic induced instability?
It was the whole system, not abusive, not malicious, but emotionally rigid, reputation-focused, and unable to attune to a child as sensitive as Vincent. The sources of instability included the replacement child dynamic, emotionally distant mother, emotionally restrained father, siblings who saw him as strange, a community that scrutinized him, boarding school separation, extended family expectations, lack of close childhood friendships. All these factors created a narcissistic emotional ecosystem, not because anyone was a narcissist, but because the system prioritized image, duty, and propriety over emotional attune. For Vincent, this leads to lasting emotional pain.
Thor, when we look at Vincent's early years, especially through his biography, He comes across as a deeply sensitive child, almost unusually so. How does that shape the way we understand his later suffering?
Vincent's childhood becomes even more revealing when we look at him not just as a sensitive boy, but as what today we would call a gifted, emotionally high sensitive child growing up in an environment that could not meet the depth of his inner world. Here we are viewing his paints a clear picture of this early temperament. A serious, sensitive boy who preferred solitude, loved flowers, birds, and insects, and appeared slightly strange to others. That's the profile of a highly sensitive child, what psychologists today call highly sensible person, HSP. These children feel more, notice more, absorb more. They're intuitive, emotionally porous, and easily overwhelmed. In the right environment, they flourish. In the wrong environment, they fractured. Vincent grew up in an environment that simply didn't know what to do with a child like that.
What made his environment so difficult for a child like Vincent?
Several things. First, the emotional tone of the household. His father was a pastor, dutiful, restrained, concerned with propriety. His mother was grieving the loss of a stillborn child born exactly 1 year before Vincent. He was born exactly 1 year after the first Vincent Willem had been stillborn. That means he entered a home marked by unspoken grief, emotional restraint, high expectations, social scrutiny. For a sensitive child, that's a perfect storm. He would have absorbed the tension, the sadness, the pressure to behave, the pressure to reflect well on the family. Sensitive children internalize everything.
Even though historical facts say there's little evidence he consciously knew about the dead brother, could the emotional atmosphere still affect him?
Absolutely. Mate's point is that trauma is not about events, it's about emotional environments. A child doesn't need to know the story to feel the grief. The psychoanalytic biographers have long explored his replacement child dynamic. A sensitive child in that situation often becomes hyper-attuned to parental moods, anxious about disappointing others, overly responsible, emotionally vigilant, prone to self-blame. These are the exact traits we see in Vincent's adult life.
His sister Elizabeth had said he appeared slightly strange to others. How does that play into this?
That's a crucial detail. When a sensitive child is labeled as strange, different, or odd, it creates a deep sense of alienation. Historical notes confirm his choice of clothing and his eating habits and solitary nature made him appear slightly strange to others from a young age. This is the beginning of the outsider identity that later becomes central to his personality. Sensitive children often withdraw when they feel misunderstood. Vincent wasn't antisocial, he was unmirrored. No one reflected his inner world back to him.
He was sent to boarding school at age 11. How does that affect a child like him?
For a highly sensitive child, being sent away can feel like abandonment. From 1864 to 1866, he attended a boarding school in Zevenbergen. This is a child who already preferred solitude because he didn't feel emotionally safe. Sending him away reinforces the message. You don't belong. You are too much. You must adapt. That's the seed of anxious, preoccupied attachment.
Historical facts confirm he was a good student but showed no early artistic genius. How does that fit into the picture?
Sensitive children often develop inwardly before they develop outwardly. He was a good student, but his eccentricities did not manifest themselves in a particularly creative or artistic manner. This tells us he was internalizing everything. His creativity was incubating beneath the surface. Sensitive children often bloom late, once they find a medium that can hold their emotional intensity. For Vincent, that medium was art.
So, when we talk about narcissistic induced instability, are we talking about abuse?
No, we're talking about a misattuned emotional environment, one shaped through a grieving mother, a reputation-focused father, siblings who saw him as strange, a community that scrutinized him, early separation at boarding school, high expectations from extended family. None of these people were narcissists. But the system had narcissistic qualities: image over authenticity, propriety over emotion, duty over individuality, restraint over expression. For a gifted, highly sensitive child, that environment is destabilizing.
And as a sensitive child who learned to survive by feeling shaped the adult he became?
Completely. His sensitivity became both his wound and his genius. The emotional instability of his childhood didn't break him, it shaped him. It made him introspective, empathetic, imaginative, and emotionally intense. It also made him vulnerable to loneliness, rejection, and despair. Vincent wasn't fragile by nature. He became fragile because he felt everything in an environment that didn't know how to feel him back.
Thor, now that we've explored Vincent as a gifted, emotionally sensitive child, I want to understand how that early sensitivity shaped his adult relationships, especially with Theo and Gauguin. These two men seem to represent opposite poles in his emotional world.
They do. And when you look at Vincent's childhood, the pattern becomes unmistakable. He was described as a serious, sensitive boy who preferred solitude and appeared slightly strange to others. That's the profile of a child who feels deeply but doesn't feel understood. And that early emotional isolation becomes the blueprint for how he relates to people later in life.
Let's start with Theo. Their relationship is legendary, almost mythic. How does Vincent's childhood sensitivity shape that bond?
Theo becomes the emotional anchor Vincent never had as a child. Historical facts makes it clear that Theo was not just a brother. He was his favorite family member as well as his closest and most devoted friend. For a child who grew up feeling strange, misunderstood, and emotionally unmirrored, Theo becomes the first person who truly sees him. A sensitive child who grows up without emotional attune often develops a deep longing for one safe person, a fear of losing that person, a tendency to idealize the relationship, a dependence on emotional reassurance. All of these show up in Vincent's letters to Theo.
So, Theo becomes a kind of corrective emotional experience?
Exactly. Theo gives him what his childhood environment couldn't: unconditional acceptance, emotional validation, belief in his talent, financial and moral support, a sense of belonging. Theo becomes the secure base that attachment theory talks about. Without Theo, Vincent's emotional world collapses. With Theo, he feels anchored enough to create.
And then there's Gauguin, fiery, charismatic, emotionally distant. How does Vincent's sensitive child pattern shape that relationship?
Gauguin triggers every childhood wound Vincent carries. Remember, Vincent is a boy who preferred solitude to the companionship of family and friends because he felt different and misunderstood. That early sense of being other becomes activated in Arles. Gauguin represents the emotionally unavailable parent, the admired but unpredictable authority figure, the person whose approval feels essential but unreachable. For a sensitive child, this dynamic is destabilizing. For the adult Vincent, it becomes catastrophic.
So, the conflict in the Yellow House wasn't just artistic, it was psychological?
Completely. Gauguin's independence and emotional detachment mirror the emotional restraint Vincent grew up with, especially from his father. Theodorus van Gogh was a pastor, a man of duty and propriety, someone who expected much from Vincent and was disappointed when he didn't conform. Gauguin unconsciously steps into that role. When Gauguin pulls away, Vincent doesn't just feel rejected, he feels abandoned. When Gauguin criticizes him, Vincent doesn't just feel corrected, he feels shamed. When Gauguin leaves, Vincent doesn't just feel lonely, he feels emotionally annihilated. This is the sensitive child reliving the emotional instability of his early years.
Interviewer, it sounds like Theo and Gauguin represent two different emotional archetypes for Vincent.
They do, and both are rooted in his childhood. Theo, the attuned caregiver he never had, emotionally present, supportive, validating, patient, protective. Theo gives Vincent the emotional safety he lacked as a child. Gauguin, the unattuned authority figure he grew up with. Unpredictable, critical, self-contained, emotionally distant, easily overwhelmed by Vincent's intensity, Gauguin recreates the emotional climate of Vincent's early home, especially the father's expectations and emotional restraint.
So, Vincent's adult relationships weren't random, they were patterned?
Exactly. Sensitive children who grow up in emotionally rigid environments often develop a relational pattern that looks like this. They cling to the one person who feels safe, Theo. They idealize emotionally unavailable people, Gauguin. They panic when they feel withdrawal. They blame themselves for relational tension. They oscillate between longing and despair. This is not pathology. It's adaptation. Vincent's adult relationships are the continuation of a childhood emotional script.
And this emotional pattern shows up in his paintings too?
Everywhere. The bedroom, longing for safety. Starry night, emotional overwhelm. Portrait of Gauguin's chair, abandonment and longing. Portrait of Theo, devotion and emotional dependence. His art is the emotional autobiography of a sensitive child trying to survive in an adult world.
Or, after everything we've explored, his sensitivity, his parents, his siblings, his early environment, I want to bring it all together. Who, ultimately, shaped Vincent van Gogh's early childhood into the person he later became?
When you look closely at his childhood, you see that Vincent wasn't shaped by one person. He was shaped by an entire emotional ecosystem. But if we had to name the core influences, they fall into four interconnected forces: his parents, his siblings, his temperament, and the emotional climate of the pastor's household. Let's start with the parents, because they set the emotional tone of the home.
How did his mother, Anna Carbenta, shape him?
She shaped him profoundly. Historical facts describes her as the mother of 6 children, including a stillborn son named Vincent born exactly 1 year before him. That grief was the emotional air he breathed as an infant. Sensitive children absorb unspoken emotions, and Anna's grief and emotional distance created a subtle but powerful message. You are loved, but I cannot fully feel you. She gave him beauty, flowers, nature, observation, but not emotional mirroring. That combination created the foundation of his lifelong longing for connection.
And his father, Theodorus?
Historical fact shows him as a pastor, dutiful, respected, morally serious, but also emotionally restrained. He expected Vincent to behave, to conform, to reflect well on the family. And Vincent, described as serious, sensitive, and slightly strange by his sister Elizabeth, simply couldn't fit that mold. This is where the idea of narcissistic-induced instability becomes relevant, not because his father was a narcissist, but because the role of pastor created a rigid emotional environment. Image mattered, propriety mattered, reputation mattered, emotional expression did not. For a highly sensitive child, that creates chronic self-doubt and emotional hypervigilance.
What about his brothers and sisters?
They shaped him through contrast. Historical facts tell us he had 5 siblings, and that Theo would become his closest friend and emotional lifeline. But the others saw him as strange, eccentric, and solitary. Sensitive children need to mirror someone who reflects their inner world back to them. Vincent didn't get that. Instead, he learned early that he was different. That difference became identity. That identity became destiny.
And his own temperament?
That's the heart of it. History describes him as serious, sensitive, solitary, nature-loving, eccentric dress and habits. This is the profile of a highly sensitive child, what psychologists call an HSP. These children feel deeply, notice everything, and are easily overwhelmed. In a nurturing environment, they become artists, thinkers, healers. In a rigid environment, they become anxious, self-doubting, and emotionally turbulent. Vincent's temperament was his gift. His environment made it his burden.
Vincent was sent to boarding school at 11. How did that shape him?
For a sensitive child, early separation is destabilizing. He attended boarding school from 1864 to 1866, then left another school abruptly due to financial strain. These disruptions reinforced the message he already felt at home. You don't belong. You are too much. You must adapt. This is the seed of anxious, preoccupied attachment.
You've used the phrase narcissistic emotional environment. What does that mean here?
It means an environment where image, authenticity, duty, emotion, propriety, individuality, restraint, expression. No one intended harm, but the system itself was emotionally rigid. For a child like Vincent, that rigidity becomes internalized as shame, self-blame, fear of disappointing others, longing for one safe person, Theo, idealization of emotionally distant figures, Gauguin. This is not mental illness. It is adaptation.
So, who shaped him?
Everyone and everything. His mother shaped his sensitivity and longing. His father shaped his self-doubt and moral seriousness. His siblings shaped his sense of being different. His temperament shaped his emotional depth. His community shaped his fear of judgment. Boarding school shaped his fear of abandonment. Theo shaped his hope. Gauguin shaped his wounds. Vincent van Gogh was not shaped by a single trauma. He was shaped by an emotional ecosystem that could not hold the depth of who he was. And yet, that same ecosystem produced the artist whose emotional honesty still moves the world.
Thor, this has been an extraordinary conversation. You've helped us see Vincent van Gogh not as a myth, not as a tragic symbol, but as a human being shaped by the emotional landscape of his childhood. Before we close, I just want to say thank you for your insight, your depth, and your willingness to sit with the complexity of who he was.
Thank you. It's been meaningful to explore him this way. Vincent deserves to be understood with nuance. When you read about his early years, being born after a stillborn brother, growing up as a sensitive child in a pastor's household, appearing slightly strange to others, preferring solitude, loving nature with an intensity that set him apart, you begin to see the emotional blueprint of the man he became. His art wasn't an accident. It was the expression of a childhood that shaped him in both beautiful and painful ways.
And you've shown us how those early forces, his mother's grief, his father's restraint, the expectations of the household, the lack of emotional mirroring, didn't just influence him. They formed the emotional soil from which his genius grew.
Exactly. Vincent wasn't broken. He was sensitive. He was gifted. He was emotionally porous in a world that didn't know how to hold a child like that. And yet, he transformed all of it, every wound, every longing, every unanswered question, into color, movement, and emotional truth. That's why he still speaks to us. His paintings are not just images. They're invitations into the inner world of someone who felt life with extraordinary depth.
Thor, thank you for helping us see him in that depth. Your perspective brings him closer, makes him more human, more understandable. It's been a privilege.
The privilege is mine. Talking about Vincent is always a reminder of how early experiences shape us, how sensitivity can be both a burden and a gift, and how art can become the language of a soul that never stopped searching for connection. I'm grateful to have shared that with you.
And perhaps that's the gift you leave us with today, the reminder that behind every masterpiece is a human being shaped long before the world ever knew their name. Vincent's story, as you've helped us see it, isn't just about art or suffering or genius. It's about a child who felt deeply, a man who kept searching, and a legacy that continues to ask us to look closer at him and maybe at ourselves. Thank you, Thor, for guiding us there with such clarity and compassion.